Daf Pei Hey Amud Aleph will begin Pei Daled Amud Beis, the Mishnah. Zok the Mishnah Minayin Laruga Shishi Shal Shisha Tvachim. How do you know if you have an aruga, a patch, a vegetable patch? The standard size of an aruga was 6 by 6 tvachim, square, 6 by 6. So that was the standard size of the vegetable patch. It was 6 by 6. And there was a border, as we'll see in the Gemara, there was a border of a tefach surrounding it. The border of a tefach that surrounded, they could walk around it and irrigate the vegetable patch. So the issue over here is in Kalayim, that the Mishnah is going to give a hechatimsa where you can plant 5 different types of vegetables or 5 different types of zroim in this standard 6 by 6 patch, aruga. And it's not a problem of Kalayim. There's no Isser Kalayim. So minayin laruga shisha al shisha tvachim shezarim b'seicha chamisha zironim, that you can plant 5 different types of zironim, a zera, dalan al dalan ruches haruga, 4 on each side, a different zera on each side of the aruga, va'achas b'amsa, and 1 in the middle. So you can plant 1 row here, you leave the corner unplanted, that's blank. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1 in the middle. Now the principle on Kalayim is, as opposed to the common misconception, that Kalayim is not an Isser of planting things together that they draw unique nourishment from the same area in the ground. That's not the Isser of Kalayim. The Isser of Kalayim is that it can't be planted where it looks like it's planted bi'erbuvia, that it's being mixed together. If they're planted in distinct areas and it's clear that there's a separation, that they're not planted bi'erbuvia with a mix, that they're not planted randomly and mixed together, then there's no problem with Kalayim. So therefore, when you have on the borders, you have one that you have to leave the corner, because otherwise if you plant right through to the end, so the planting here and the planting here will be irbuvia, that'll be running into each other. They'll be mixed together. But if you leave a tefach blank in each corner, so you can plant 1 here and 1 here, they're clearly planted in different directions. One is planted this way, the other one is vertical. This is horizontal, this is vertical. And here it's horizontal and vertical. So it's clear that they're in different directions. There's no problem of Kalayim, even though they're in close proximity to each other. Now in the middle, that's where you have to leave a separation, and in order to be distinct and not be erbuvia, over there it has to be a separation where it's separated kedei yanika, that they're not, the roots are not deriving nourishment from the same places in the ground. So therefore, you have to leave the standard shear of yanika is a tefach and a half. If this is including the place of the zera, including the makom of the zera, if this is 6 by 6, if this is 6 by 6, then if you plant in the middle, you have 3 tvachim on each side. That means the row over here derives nourishment 1.5 tvachim. The planting in the middle, also in each direction, derives nourishment from the ground 1.5 tvachim. But if you have a 3 tefach separation on each side, then you can plant in the middle. So the ones on the side, on the perimeter, we're not concerned about yanika, because since they're planted in different directions, it's not Kalayim. It's clear that they're not planted together. The one in the middle, there's no different direction between the planting on the perimeter and the middle. So here you need a separation of kedei yanika. That's why you can only plant 1 in the middle. It has 3 tvachim from here to here, and from here to here there's 3 tvachim, and from each side there's 3 tvachim. If this is 6 by 6, then there's going to be 3 tvachim in every direction. There's going to be a separation of 3 tvachim, which allows the separation of kedei yanika. So it's not that you need a separation of kedei yanika per se. It's when they're not planted in different directions, there you need the separation of Kedei Yanika. So the Mishnah says, therefore, we can, in a ruga, the standard size of ruga, which is 6 by 6, you can plant 5 zironim, dalar dal ruchas ruga ve'achas be'em. So how do we know this? Shenemar, the pasuk says, ki ka'eretz taitzi simcha, u'kigana zerueha tatzmiach. Zara lai nemar ela zerueha. So the moral darshan, we'll see what the drush is over here, how you learn out that there's 5 zironim. But we learn out over here from the pasuk in Yeshayim that it will be like a garden that produces, that grows its roim. So my mashma, how do you learn out from the pasuk that there's 5 zeroinim? My mashma, Rav Yura, ki ke'eretz, taitzi simcha, taitzi chad. Simcha is chad, hare trey. It's another one, that's total of 2. Zeru it says in the plural, it's trey. It's another 2, ha'arba. Tatzmiya chad, ha'chamisha. So that means, so we learn out, that means 5 zeroinim. There's 5 plantings. Vikim l'Rabbanan dechamisha b'shisa layan kimadari. And Rabbanan, they established that the 5 different plantings in an area of 6 by 6. So if you have the plantings 5 each direction and one in the middle in an area that's 6 by 6, there will not be a yanika from the middle to anywhere on the perimeter. So they knew that that distance, the distance of 3 tefachim, including the makom of the zera, that would establish that there's no yanika, they're not being yoinek, they're not deriving nourishment from the same place in the ground. How do we know that the Rabbanan were experts in agriculture and they knew what distance is required to ensure that there was no yanika from the same place on the ground? How do we know, where do we see that the Rabbanan were experts in this area? The Gemara's question seems to be a little bit difficult to understand. Some of the Meforshim explain it as follows. Bishloma, when we have a halach l'Moshe Sinai, so there's no question in the matter. That was halach l'Moshe Sinai. But over here, in this matter over here, what we're discussing in the Mishnah, it's not halach l'Moshe Sinai. It's something that the Rabbanan determined. So where do we see that the Rabbanan were experts in agriculture? But the question is still difficult. It's still very difficult to understand it because, well, obviously, if it is stated in the Mishnah, if the Rabbanan said it, they must have determined it. Now, they wouldn't have stated it unless they felt that they were experts. So why are we questioning it? If they stated that this is the fact, they must have determined it, and however they determined it. So why are we even questioning where do we see that the Rabbanan were experts in agriculture? Perhaps the pshat is that the question is that how do we know that when the Rabbanan stated this, that we take it as they are the complete authorities in this matter, and even if it's determined otherwise through scientists or they determine otherwise that this is not the case. Nevertheless, just like we rely on the Rabbanan in other matters, and in matters of halacha and things that are learned out of the Yud Gimel Midas, that the Rabbanan, when they determine this, we give it the full authority of what the Rabbanan said, just like we do in other matters. So how do we know that? It says, so literally the pasuk says you can't move the boundaries, you can't steal a person's land and move the boundaries. It says the boundaries that the Rishonim, the earlier ones, established. So it's a little difficult to understand the pasuk. What do you mean? Only the boundaries that the Rishonim established. You can't be Masechet Gvul. You can't remove the boundaries and boundaries that weren't established by the Rishonim. That you could remove the boundaries? Obviously not. So what is the emphasis over here on the pasuk? Why does the pasuk emphasize Asher Gavul Rishonim? So Gvul Shegol Rishonim Loy Sasik. It means that the Gvul that the Rishonim the Chachamim, the Rabbanan, that they established that the gvul, that the boundaries that they said that you have to be marchik, you have to distance your planting from somebody else's field. So in order not to be yonik, that your planting, your Zerayim should not be yonik from the other person's field, those harchakas, those distances that the Rabbanan said that you have to distance your planting from your neighbor's field, you cannot violate that. So we see over here that the Rabbanan were experts in agriculture. The Torah is giving them that authority. They're saying that whatever the Rabbanan said, that as far as in a field, you have to distance yourself from your neighbor's field so as not to steal, so to speak, from his field, not to be masek him, not to have your planting draw the nourishment away from his field. You have to adhere to that. You have to be bound by that. So we see that the Rabbanan are considered to be experts in this matter. Rashi is learning the drasha is in terms of gezel, not in terms of kilayim. That the drasha is that you have to distance your planting from your neighbor's field so as not to draw away the nourishment and derive nourishment from his field, so it's an Indian of Gzela. The way Taisa is learning is that it's not only Gzela the Indian, it's also teaching you the halach of kilayim. It's also relevant to our discussion of kilayim as well. So further on this matter, we see that people are experts in the earlier generations. They were experts in agriculture. It says with the pasuk, so these are the descendants of Seir who were dwellers on the land. So other people lived in the sky and the rakia, in the heavens. Why does the pasuk emphasize that these were people who were Yoshvei Haaretz? Aren't everybody Yoshvei Haaretz? Ella, what's the emphasis on Yoshvei Haaretz? Ella shu bikim b'yeshuva shel haaretz. They were bikim in the settling of the land and how to settle the land. They would say that this measurement, the Knei Hamida, the measuring area, plant over here, this is a good area to plant over here, olives. And another area of land, they would say that this soil over here is suitable for grapes. Plant a grapevine over here. This measured area, this litain, is for figs. And it says, and it says the chayri, they called them the chayri because they were merichem, they smelled the land, and with their smell they were able to determine which land is suitable to plant what by the smell. The chivi, and the pasuk continues and mentions the chivi. Why were they called this nation called the chivi? They would taste the soil, and based on the taste, they would determine that this soil is suitable to plant this or that other type of zera. Like they would taste it like a chivya, like a snake. The snake, he eats the earth. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar, he said another the reason why they were called chayri. He said chayri shenasu b'nei chayrim minachasayim. They became freed from their property, so to speak. They were chased out of the land by Bnei Seir, so they became the Bnei Esav. They were chased out of the land, and they became Bnei Chorin, so to speak. They became freed from their property. So back to the halach in the Mishnah. Amravasi aruga teicha v'avchus migvula. The standard size of the aruga, as we mentioned, is 6 by 6, 6 tefachim by 6 tefachim. Besides the border around it, which we had a walkway around it, the border, which was, as we'll see, which was a tefach of a border. Tanya namahachi aruga teicha shisha. The planted area was 6, it's 6 by 6. V'ula b'kama. What was the border? What was the size of the border? Kiddusan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer roichev kimolei roichev parsa. The width of it, of the border, was like the width of a standard foot. So that was, and which is a tefach. My time is Rabbi Yehuda. What's the time of Rabbi Yehuda? He says that the roicha, the width of the border is kamalei parsa. So the Eretz Mitzrayim was the land that you watered. You had to water it by hand. And like Kigan Hayorik, it says, Vishkisa Baraglecha, you have to walk around the area and water and irrigate it. It could not grow only by rainwater. You have to irrigate it with Baraglecha, by foot. So ma regel tefach, a regel is standard size is a tefach, agvul nami tefach, the border is a tefach. Omarav arugim b'churba shanina. He says, when we discuss over here in the Mishnah this aruga, we have to be talking about in an area that there's nothing else planted, and a churba, nothing else planted around it, a desolate area. Because even though, like we mentioned, that you can plant all around in the middle, but if you have another patch that's just next to it, then you'll have the erbuvia of what's planted next to it. So it has to be b'churba, there's nothing else around, because even within this area, even though it's true that this area, you can plant 5 different types of planting of zroim in this area over here, but if you're going to plant next to it, then you'll have the kalayim of what's planted here next to here. So it has to be b'churba. Frank the Gemara, why is that so? Why does it have to be in a churba? You have the corners. You can plant one next to each other, and you can plant, and you have by putting the corners, planting the corners in different areas. If you have 2 arugas and you plant the arugas on side by side, you have the patches over here. Now they can be side by side, the different patches, if you plant in different directions. If you plant one planting here, this area is planted here. There has to be the walkway in between. And if you plant this area, for instance, over here, and if you plant on the next one, you plant here. And if you plant this one here, and you plant this one here. Now, if you plant the corners and don't plant all the way down, in the scenario that we discussed earlier, you're planting all the way down. You just left the corners blank. But if you, instead of planting all across, instead of planting that way, if you plant the corners and leave the areas blank, for instance, so this area over here, leave this blank, this whole area, plant up here. And on this one next to it, so you plant, on this one next to it, you plant down here, and leave this area blank over here. So then you'll never be planting side by side. As we mentioned, the whole problem, the whole issue over here is planting erbuvia. But if you plant it in different directions, and don't plant all across and down. So this one, you're planting over here, this is on this corner. And on this one over here, you're planting down here. So this is perpendicular. They're not side by side. They're planted in different directions, so there's no erbuvia. Now, you don't plant all the way down. You only plant on the corners, but you plant the corners in different directions. This is planted here and here. And this one is planted over here. And so everyone is planted in a different direction. As you see in Rashi has this illustration, and the Gemara has illustration of how it's planted, each one in a different direction. And you don't have parallel rows. They're perpendicular to each other, but you don't have parallel planting rows. So why do you have to say it's b'churba? Why don't you say that we're planted in that kind of direction? We're talking about in a chanami, theoretically you could, but we're talking in a scenario where he is planting in the corners. He plants the corners. So we'll continue in the Gemara. We'll see weiter. Why don't you have, also you have in different scenarios, even if you're planting in the corner, Gemara will ask, you can also come up with different scenarios where you could plant different arugas. So we'll see, as Gemara will discuss, that there are different chetimses, but what was forcing him to say bechurba, we'll see in the next Talmud.